Hey, this is Sabrina Monarch of Monarch Astrology, and I'm bringing you the astrology forecast of June 3rd to June 9, 2020. And I'm going to go right ahead and pull up my slides. So we have a full moon eclipse in Sagittarius, and Venus is retrograde. We cannot see her. She will emerge as a morning star, but she is currently invisible and in the underworld. So we're days away from this full moon eclipse, and rather than begin really with the astrology in depth, I want to speak to social events that have emerged that have the astrology written all over it in so many ways. And it may not be the most important thing right now to analyze the astrology as though to abstract from something really important that's happening. Astrology can help us get deeper into it. So I want to offer that as well, but I also want to just presence it in of itself. So I still have astrological thoughts for you today, but I want to zoom into earthly events first. I am in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and I don't want to deliver a forecast, business as usual, without speaking to this. For the Black people in my audience who are reading and listening, I pray that you are supported, that you are heard, that this world truly shifts. And I'm sorry for the injustices that you face and have faced. And I don't have the words. I know that saying this is not enough, that I need to do better and to educate myself and to take actions to set in motion a more just reality. And I know that I can't possibly understand your experience as though it were my own, and I'm listening. Readers and listeners, I know I'm speaking to a wide group of people from different backgrounds and with different orientations to reality. And I want to take a moment to urge those of you, when I'm already, not already speaking to the choir, to center Black voices and to listen without argument, without the knee-jerk response to debate Black Lives Matter, but to actually listen and believe Black experiences. White people like myself, I am also specifically not asking you to ask Black and POC to educate you, Black people and POC to educate you or process racism with you. But you can totally utilize Google and a bunch of books and resources out there on the topic from voices who are speaking on this issue. Find peers who are doing this inquiry with you. We're in this, Jupiter, Pluto, and Capricorn time period. And it feels like part of the expansion that Jupiter is normally about is really about descent and kind of pulling back the veil of society and what society is built on. And the inherent racism that is systemically designed and built into the government, into the country, into the workings of society. And that while many people are not chosen racists, there's a way that our culture and that our society is systemically racist. And that if we want to change that, we have to uncover it and know what we're working from to create change. I don't talk a lot about politics and social issues and human rights issues on my platform. I normally talk about things from a more subtle, numinous, kind of mystical lens, because that's my strength and my gift is to, feel into the subtle threads of the collective and paint this word tapestry. And I noticed that, for that very reason, my messaging on this platform can attract people of different political stances, different stances on this issue. And so I'm aware of that as I was going in to write this forecast. And I noticed that when I'm on social media and someone says Black Lives Matter, someone inevitably pipes up with, but all lives matter, or even, stop being anti-white. And, some of the books on this list that I have pictured here are kind of like helping guide people through those knee-jerk defenses to the conversation. And rather than create alienation in my community, which is not my goal, if you've resonated with my work for some time and my ask for you to really listen to Black people and Black voices is jarring to you in some way, I hope that we've already developed enough of a friendship over the higher airwaves that you can trust me and hear this. And ultimately, it's not like I'm not the one to be listening to. I'm speaking on behalf, and I want this to be an invitation, if you're not already researching this topic or actually really hearing the subject, to go listen to people who are an authority on it. The injustices that Black people face are heartbreaking, and it's heartbreaking to watch others want to argue, debate about it, not believe it. The behavior and denial that really essentially continues to perpetuate the existence of systems of oppression when we as a collective passively accept it. I actually wrote and spoke about gaslighting as a possibility last week with the Venus-Mars square, Venus retrograde in Gemini, square Mars in Pisces. And unfortunately, my expectations were exceeded on the collective stage. I'm not an expert by any means on race or race relations. Recent events have moved me in a very deep way and shown me that I need to read more books and do more research and gain more perspective, and that this is an imperative part of my spiritual path. That just as I've chosen to incarnate fully into my being, my SabrinaMonarch self, my body, that I think that there's also a way to incarnate into the societies and the cultures that we live in. And just like I do shadow work to become a better version of myself, when we actually, really investigate the culture that we are participating in, we become agents of change because we no longer perpetuate things from a place of unconsciousness, but we can become more aware. Meditations on Pluto and Capricorn for all these years. It's been in Capricorn. Pluto has been in Capricorn as a world transit since 2008, and I started tuning into it in 2012. My meditations on it all these years has taught me that we're undergoing a collective shift in the ethos of society, and at a personal level, we are experiencing moral transformations. For an individual, this Pluto and Capricorn time period can be the process of deconstructing the ways which we've internalized social norms, and through our unconscious complicity with the system, how we perpetuate it. I acknowledge that I have work to do, and I want to invite anyone in my audience like me who is white and whose whiteness benefits them in a systemically racist society to hear the awakening bells of this moment in time. It isn't the first. Notice where life itself is giving you the invitation to embark upon a deeper inquiry of understanding. The nodes of the moon have only just entered the Gemini-Sagittarius axis, which is all about higher learning and multiculturalism. Now is a time for education and learning about other cultures as well as the blind spots of our own. Now, if you want to do something to help immediately, these are some donations or some organizations that you can donate to. And for anyone who's listening to this recording on the podcast and not seeing the image, I will name them aloud. There's the George Floyd Memorial Fund, the Minnesota Freedom Fund, Black Visions Collective, Reclaim the Block, Campaign Zero, and Unicorn Riot. And these are all things you can Google and read more about and donate to. So before we get into our week, a few announcements. One is that there's a new episode of the podcast out. Magic of the Spheres is my podcast. I interviewed Geo Marcus of Copy Mafia and had a really delightful conversation with her about her journey as a professional writer. So becoming a professional at something that people say is hard to have a career in. And this episode is for you if you have a brand or are thinking of having one, because learning how to communicate your brand is essential to build a bridge between what you have to offer and who you intend to reach. We talked about the ways that having a personal brand can embolden you, even that you can step into your personal brand as a way to grow into yourself. So I'm going to leave the link for this episode in the notes, but you can also look up Magic of the Spheres on your podcast app of choice and check out this episode. It's a podcast about astrology and personal development and spiritual lifestyle, and there's so many great episodes out there. My second announcement is that I have a Kickstarter coming to crowdfund the year ahead of content creation. And June has now just begun my 6th year of content creation, of writing these weekly forecasts. And now we've expanded to YouTube, and there's the podcast Magic of the Spheres. And I'm going to be offering astrology readings, discounted tuition to my upcoming evolutionary astrology course, a new course about online presence, and some other things for you. And I'd like, to be considered like public radio. And if you benefit from the things that I share, I would love your help funding it and funding the possibility for this platform to continue existing. And here's our week. June 3rd, 2020. The Sun in 13 degrees of Gemini will be conjunct Venus retrograde in 13 degrees of Gemini at 10:44 a.m. Pacific. And this is the heart of the Venus retrograde. This is if you ever see the orbital pattern of the Sun and Venus, they form a beautiful 5-pointed star. And each Venus retrograde where the Sun and Venus conjunct during the retrograde, that's when you get one of the points of this 5-pointed star that the Sun and Venus make. So it's kind of a magical moment. And I've been talking about Venus retrogrades as pretty magical. And they are this opportunity for heart opening. So that theme of heart opening is really like something that I've been thinking about. Venus is diving into the underworld. We can't see her in the sky, and we won't for a little bit. She will reemerge as a morning star. So I want you to let the symbolism of Venus going into the underworld really sink in, if you haven't already noticed that vibe in the collective social atmosphere. The lesson that is coming through this Venus retrograde in Gemini that not everyone is willing to learn, but I hope more and more people will, just speaking from bias here, is intellectual empathy and being able to genuinely consider a variety of perspectives in a way that, creates more equity. Venus is all about fairness and justice. And though everyone has a right to express and feel understood, this is an ideal that is more complex in practice and involves appropriate timing. There is also something to be said about certain voices retreating, decentering their perspective, and taking a step back. Every time, like as I was saying, every time that Black Lives Matter comes especially to the forefront of collective attention, speaking here from the US, there are plenty of voices that want to debate, complain, or otherwise attempt to invalidate Black experiences, all in this kind of thought of like, well, free speech. There's a time to just listen and to be moved. I think that Venus going into the underworld and Venus retrograde can symbolize, and I'm going to be talking more about this throughout this forecast, like what it means to actually experience the dissent that is being moved by another person. Because when we're operating through life from like a kind of narcissistic way of like, we're just radiating ourselves and our truth out and only accepting reflections that reflect us in exactly the way that we want to be reflected, we kind of maintain whatever self-image that we want. If we take in a perspective that triggers us or challenges us, then transformation of the heart happens. So on a small note here, at a personal level, Venus retrograde symbolizes an increased need at times for taking the time to check in with how we're doing, what we need, and what we would feel nourishing, what would feel nourishing and valuable to us. So when we find ourselves getting really hung up about what another person thinks about us, feeling into how do we feel, sometimes that will prove very helpful and necessary. There's the balance, there's the dance with Venus of considering the other and also considering ourselves. And Venus retrograde has this internalization quality to it. And this can be meaningful at times. So one of the ways that this can come through is when we feel turned in on ourselves a little bit, like there's some kind of validation or some positive affirmation that we want that we're not getting from the external environment, and what it would mean to source that kind of love for ourselves. And then it's an entirely different thing to receive love when we're coming from a place of self-possession than when we're not self-possessed and we're just kind of asking for things from the outside world without having that interior connection built. Now, to talk about Venus retrograde at this crucial moment, I want to include an analysis that I shared on Facebook the other day. So this is a quote from me. We're in a Venus retrograde, square Mars, and some basic Venus-Mars square possibilities can be conflict in relationships and and fighting injustice. As it's also Venus retrograde, reminiscing on the past is a possibility. I'm drawn to thinking about the Yes All Women and Me Too saga as a lesson for today. I wonder if anyone else notices the same or notices some connections between Me Too and Black Lives Matter in the following way. Me Too was preceded by Yes All Women in 2014. Yes All Women was a movement of women sharing that all women had to worry about sexual violence and sexual assault. And just a bunch of stories pouring through about how women had organized their lives to protect themselves from that potential danger. And hordes of men being shocked, like we had no idea. And there was actually really this defensive backlash of not all men, as in, not all men hurt women, and a bunch of men being like, not us, not us. And as time went on, I actually watched large numbers of men take in the narratives of women and essentially feel brought down to their knees by it. Like there was a mass humbling. The same people arguing not all of us started to realize how ingrained into society and into themselves these behaviors were, and the ways that they perpetuated it. And I also watched a lot of men change and culture even change after that. And then Me Too came along, and it was like people were primed, and Me Too was a big transformative moment. And I hear people talk about Me Too a lot without talking about Yes All Women, and that was a pivotal shift. And where I see a similarity between those movements and Black Lives Matter is that white people are similarly triggered by conversations of race and whiteness. And there's a defensive layer of trying to sidetrack the convo, like all lives matter, or don't be anti-white, or I'm not racist, etc. Instead of dealing with the process of disentangling oneself from systemic racism. The two movements are not the same, but the ego deaths they involve remind me of one another, and the connection gives me hope. I'm just imagining the energy allocation from defending one's virtue within an unjust system, and within that unjust system, it has been internalized in the self. So instead of allocating all that energy to defend that, and to defend one's ego, to allocating that energy to actually taking in the dissent and the disillusionment. Otherwise, the virtue that one is defending is just like a castle in the clouds lacking ground. Since one of the action steps frequently suggested by activists is education, and education is a lifelong process, I wanted to share this parallel. As long as men were arguing it wasn't them, they weren't helping shift the culture. I see this for whiteness too. As long as it is defending itself, it is perpetuating its abuses still, and complicit abuses in maintaining a systemically racist society. I watched men in a lot of cases during the Yes All Women and Me Too become more aware of their harm, their unintentional harm as well. And with this knowledge, change and support change. And white people can and ought to do the same, myself included. I predicted gaslighting for this Venus-Mars square last week as one of the possibilities, and my expectations were exceeded, unfortunately. But I also felt into a higher possibility, which was discovering how to have empathy for people with way different experiences. That means listening, even when the message deconstructs or challenges premises that we have about ourselves. It's not the individual's fault that society is what it is, but it is the individual's responsibility to work with what they've inherited instead of denying that it's even there. There's a lot of resistances toward accepting that responsibility, the discomfort, the pain, the time, etc., and consequences for not accepting it. It's like Saturn. Some things have this edge of inevitability to them, and they press us to do the work that is the integral thing to do. We want a better world, and we are each unique centers of consciousness whose inner transformation can change the world. The inner descent, Venus going into the underworld, catalyzed by an external world in upheaval, may well be part of this transformation of the world. The people who criticize the protests or criticize how Black people respond to the injustices systemically leveraged at them don't yet get it. And the system is designed to support not getting it. Untangling these dynamics as they live in the self and in individual hearts is part of creating shift, and it starts with actually listening. And then June 5th, 2020, Mercury in 8 degrees of Cancer, sextile Uranus in 8 degrees of Taurus at 4:05 a.m. Pacific. Mercury and Uranus transits, when they transit each other, can relate to a wired thinking process or a wired nervous system, and the processes that we engage that help us regulate or bring health to the nervous system, like breath work, herbs, mantra, being outside in nature. Think of what it is for you that really helps regulate you. Cancer and Taurus are a classic domestic bliss blend, both of them enjoying coziness and creature comforts. There can be stressors present which rev up our mind, though this sextile may correlate with benefits that come from taking the time to self-soothe, to eat and sleep well, and to perform tasks which bring greater harmony to our lives. And there's a way to, like, for me, something that I can think about is like as a writer, and I often have like a lot of things that I'm like writing under deadline. Soothing my nervous system doesn't mean that I don't do anything. Like, unless I am intentionally just resting, sometimes it's supporting my nervous system that actually helps me engage further. So there can be that side of it as well. Then Mercury, this same day, in 8 degrees of Cancer, will square Chiron in 8 degrees of Aries at 6:40 a.m. Pacific. And Mercury in Cancer is such a sensitive archetype. And here it is getting some voltage from Uranus, and then square to pain point and gatekeeper of initiatory processes, the wounded healer, Chiron. And so some thoughts on this Mercury-Chiron square. Chiron is the slower moving body here. It takes longer to go through the zodiac, 52 years. And Mercury in Cancer is faster. It goes through the zodiac much quicker. And so Mercury in Cancer is effectively like separating from Chiron. Like it was sooner that Mercury, it's like buzzing around. And so it's separating from the last time it made a conjunction to Chiron and Aries, and now is forming a first quarter square to Chiron. And first quarter squares are critical turning points, places of making new decisions. And here it can be a critical turning point related to our cognition of a wound or pain point in our experience. And while Aries is more likely to just jump in or go for it or just do it, Cancer works around an issue. If there's something in your life that hurts too much, or is there something in your life that hurts too much for you to address it directly? And rather than avoiding it completely, is there a way you can work your way into it? What thoughts, practices, or symbolic acts would loosen the situation at hand and break it down into more accessible pieces? And this is something to think about, for a lot of people that follow astrology. So a lot of you all, something in our like kind of spiritual and healing communities, there can be an ambition to become more spiritual, to heal faster, to become more knowledgeable and all of that. And that's great in one sense. And also sometimes there are tender parts of life that you don't just like punch into them. Maybe you do sometimes. Other times there can be a softer unwinding. When I think of actually Cancer and Aries energy together, or Moon-Mars connection at all, massage therapy is actually one of the images where you have the force of Mars and Aries, the firm touch, but the caress of the moon and Cancer. And so you're like massaging through knots in the muscle. And there's a way that when we're working with painful content in our own minds or hearts, that you can massage it out. And so sometimes there's ways that we can work with that dynamism between the tenderness of Cancer and the straightforwardness of Mars and Aries. And then we have the lunar eclipse, full moon lunar eclipse in 15 degrees of Sagittarius at 12:12 p.m. Pacific. And this is the same day, June 5th. And there's noises coming from the kitchen. Perfect for the moon. Anyway, this lunar eclipse forms a tight T-square to Mars in 15 degrees of Pisces. They're like exact. They're all, it's a tight Mars square, the eclipse. And eclipses are more intense lunations. So if you understand Mars and Mars significations around kind of war and aggression, I mean, this is clearly a very strong theme in the collective. The militarization of police, the killings with impunity, the rebelling of that. These are Martian themes. So the north node of the moon, where energy is flooding into the planet, where a point of evolution is. For those of you that follow soul-based astrology and work with the nodes, then both nodes are always important. It's important. It's not just that we're moving towards the north node and ditching the south node. That won't get you to good places if you're working with your own chart that way, because it's like suppressing a whole side of your karmic history. But typically, when we're talking about the collective nodes, the north node of the moon or the head of the dragon, this is a place where energy is influxing or like coming into the planet. And the south node is where things are draining or leaving when we're speaking of collective experiences. And the north node is Gemini right now, pointing to some critical need to take in new perspectives, some of which may literally eclipse our previous beliefs and understandings, Moon in Sagittarius, or begin to reveal new ones. So, my friends, talking about events on Earth has eclipsed my astrological interpretations this week in a way that is not characteristic of how I forecast, but it had to be done. So this is what I've got left for you. The Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter. And for more information on this lunation, we can look to where Jupiter is in the sky right now. And Jupiter is in Capricorn retrograde, also conjunct Pluto, Capricorn retrograde. And Jupiter in Capricorn is not traditionally an auspicious alignment. It's either fall or detriment. I'm still learning the essential dignities, so excuse me for not knowing that right now. But it does relate to, Jupiter in Capricorn relates to the expansion that's possible from facing cold, hard realities. And of course, Jupiter is a visionary planet and a great benefic. And yet, what are we to create and build in the world if we're not even honest about where we are starting from? Jupiter in Capricorn and conjunct underworld planet Pluto is the call for deeper awareness of the roots. And also, maybe deconstructing this idea that we should just be permanently growing and growing and growing and expanding, which is not sustainable. Sometimes, life contracts or pulls us back for a reason. And this feels like something that's happening right now with becoming, this invitation into descent of peeling back the layers of what society is and what it's made of. One of the wisdoms of Saturn and Capricorn is looking back into history, and that when, there's other kind of archetypal forces at play that just want to say, forget history, start with where we are now or be futuristic. But when history is unconsciously, when we have our tendrils or our roots unconsciously in the past and in historical patterns, then we're just carrying that stuff with us into the future. So part of growth sometimes, part of expansion is about becoming more aware, learning where we come from, learning what society, is built on historically, and actually taking in that knowledge. So this is what I have for you this week. The week ends with the Sun square Mars, and I mostly just included that in the forecast, but it's a Martian week with the eclipse squaring Mars. If you want to work with me, I do astrology readings, and I'm also moving more towards mentorship and working with people in an ongoing way. So if you're interested in working with me around processes that you're going through, goals that you have, things you want to bring into your life or things you want to heal, I'm really enjoying mentoring people one-on-one using astrology and transits and counseling dynamics to support you in that way. I also do astrology readings, and if you want to find me on social media, I'm at SabrinaMonarch on Instagram, at Sabrina_Monarch on Twitter, and I would love it if you would subscribe to this channel and like this video. Thank you so much for being here.